Hi, I'm Peter Chan, National Weather Service Program Lead of the Alaska Weather Show, and I have a very important change notice to share with you. The last TV broadcast of the Alaska Weather Show in the traditional sense over the airwaves will be on Saturday, June 30th. Starting on July 1st and thereafter, the National Weather Service will provide a modified web-based version of the program on a new YouTube channel. So that means you'll be able to find us. We'll be moving from @AKwx TV to @NWS Alaska, and you can go ahead and subscribe to that channel now. There will be a public comment period from May 15th through July 30th, so please send your comments or concerns to nws.service-change-comments@noaa.gov. And if you have any other questions, you may reach carrie.haisley at noaa.gov and donald.moore@noaa.gov. Thank you for your patience and understanding.
First weather graphic today, the hazardous weather graphic, and still have the flood watches going here for the let me get the right hand here, for the Yukon River at Fort Yukon and then on down to Tanana. Flood watch there for snowmelt and ice jam flooding remains out. A watch, not a warning, just a watch means it's possible. And then also a flood watch continues down here for the Kuskokwim River, mostly downstream from Calskag, and that's also just a watch for possible ice jam flooding there. And for satellite imagery, we've got nice conditions, big area high pressure here over the, actually centered over the southern panhandle, but dominating much of the Northwest Territories and into the Gulf here, and also into the eastern interior, keeping it mostly dry. A little cooler today than it was yesterday, but generally a lot of sunshine with areas of, some areas of clouds. Heavier back here to the west with that chilly low over the Yukon Delta continues to spin there throughout the day today, and some moisture into the Kuskokwim Valley. Otherwise, partly sunny day, partly and mostly sunny areas of Cook Inlet, the Kenai Peninsula, on up into the Manuska Valley, on toward Fairbanks area, and then clouds up here over the North Slope and northerly flow, bringing cold air all the way down to the eastern Aleutians. Light snow at times today over the Fox Islands. Pretty much ended now for the Pribilofs, but still temperatures on the chilly side there. And rolling this through again out to the west, no big storms at all. You can see this area clouds kind of shifting southward, high pressure taking over the western and central Bering Sea. As you can see here, pretty strong center there at about 1,040 millibars near the western Aleutians. Otherwise, we have this stationary low that's slowly weakening. In fact, it's going to start weakening even faster here tonight. But today kept it cloudy, cool with areas of snow and rain mixed, more showery as you head east here, and that would become more rain oriented, but pretty light here into the central interior. Also along that trough back to the northeast there, dry and some sun here over the eastern interior on down to the North Gulf Coast, as well as Kodiak Island. Dry conditions there, light winds, mostly sunny over the panhandle today. Temperatures well into the 60s. In fact, a lot of areas well into the 70s as well. Again, there for the panhandle. A little cooler here over the interior, but still seeing some 60s showing up over the eastern interior at mid-afternoon. And for tonight, that low weakens into a trough. Just a few lingering snow showers here with that, and it's just about gone. Some snow shower chances continue, becoming widely scattered to isolated as the night wears on for the eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula. Dry over interior Alaska, possible flurries for the eastern Arctic coast with that trough there. Otherwise, dry conditions continue for the southeast coast with light winds across the entire Bering Sea, even up in towards St. Lawrence Island, the Chukchi Sea there. And for the day Thursday, we're looking at high pressure holding out here, but weakening over the western Aleutian areas, but that keeping the Bering Sea in a light wind pattern with mostly dry weather. Still an isolated snow shower or two possible for the Fox Islands. It's nothing significant. It's just there's nothing else in the way of any precipitation to talk about. Maybe some flurries for the eastern Arctic coastal areas, and maybe a risk of a thunderstorm, possibly. Just a slight threat there for the Misty Fjords area. But this trough may bring a chance of rain into the Kodiak Island area, especially the southern Kodiak Island area, AKwx, Sitkinak, and those areas. Maybe a little bit of a pickup in the winds, and that's about it. So moving on to the day for Friday, that front moves northward, bringing clouds and moisture into south central Alaska, Copper River Basin, periods of rain, northern Panhandle along the North Gulf Coast, western Prince William Sound, southern Kenai Peninsula into Kamishak Bay. That's where the rain will be the heaviest. Kodiak Island, pretty wet day as well. Periods of rain for the Alaska Peninsula and up to the eastern Aleutians, but north of the Alaska Range stays mostly sunny and dry, with mostly sunny skies extending all the way up to the Arctic coast. And for lows tonight in the 40s for the Panhandle, 30s over the remainder of southern Alaska, and then the highs tomorrow in the 60s here most places of southern Alaska. A little cooler for Bristol Bay in the mid to upper 50s there, lower 50s Kodiak Island, and the coastal areas of Cook Inlet, of course, in the upper 50s, and looks like 70s to lower 80s. Klawock might top out at 82 tomorrow. Otherwise, lows the following morning, 40s or 50 to 55 for the Panhandle, 40s now over interior Alaska, southern interior Alaska, followed by highs near 70 Copper River Basin, 60s over the Kuskokwim Valley, and 55 to 60 for Bristol Bay. Cooler there, Kodiak Island with the clouds, and cooler temperatures as well, that front moving in and the rain for the Panhandle. Up to the north, lows in the 30s and 20s, followed by highs 65 to 70 east, and upper 20s to upper 30s for the Seward Peninsula and the Arctic coast. And for the lows, 30s and 40s, 20s, Brooks Range on up to the Arctic coast and the Bering Strait, followed by highs rebounding mid-70s here, Fairbanks eastward to Eagle and Chicken.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
On to flying weather, IFR here along the west coast there, down across Nunivak Island. Marginal VFR, Bering Sea, all the Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula up into Bristol Bay. Also covering the Kuskokwim Delta, VFR, eastern northern interior, some IFR up there for the eastern Arctic coast and North Slope, and then good VFR here, North Gulf Coast, Gulf of Alaska, and the Panhandle. Have some moisture here trying to build there, but mostly stays off the coast through tomorrow afternoon, maybe a little bit getting into Dixon entrance there, maybe, and then marginal VFR, eastern Arctic coast, VFR, interior Alaska, here from Kodiak Island, North Gulf Coast, on up to the Arctic coast. Solid marginal VFR, I'd call it areas of here from the northwest coast, covering the Bering Sea, Aleutians, and Alaska Peninsula. And for Friday morning, VFR in the interior, marginal VFR with areas of IFR out over the Bering Sea, especially into the Bering Strait here, Arctic coast, and part of the North Slope looks a little marginal tomorrow. Kodiak, Bristol Bay, on up toward Nunivak Island, VFR, and deteriorating conditions here over the Panhandle. Some moisture coming up from the south and southeast here, bringing IFR into the southern southeast coast, marginal VFR Friday morning, all the way up in toward Haines and Skagway. And then for Friday afternoon, that whole area shifts northwestward here. And so we got IFR in the forecast for the southern eastern side of the Kenai Peninsula, western Prince William Sound, the North Gulf Coast there, northern Panhandle down along the central coast, staying good VFR in the interior, possible marginal VFR into southern and western Cook Inlet, Kodiak Island, a little more likely there, lower conditions. Also some IFR along the Alaska Peninsula, the eastern Aleutians, and from Atka westward to Shemya, looking marginal there. VFR, northern Bering Sea, Nunivak Island, and through St. Lawrence Island, VFR, Chukchi Sea, northwest coast, all the way up to the Arctic coast. Good VFR flying. And for passes for Anatuvik tomorrow, starting out marginal, becoming VFR. Adigan, starting out marginal, becoming VFR in the late morning to afternoon hours. Lake Clark and Merrill, though, VFR the entire day. And for rainy, VFR as well, with Windy Pass, VFR. and Isabel VFR. So the entire Alaska range wide open tomorrow for flying. Mentasta, ceilings visibility is unlimited. And for Tanita VFR, Portage, same forecast, looking good with VFR. And for Chilkoot and White, looks like one more day of VFR flying there. And for the freezing levels, still warm air aloft here, Western Canada, upper level ridging, southern panhandle at least through tomorrow morning and tomorrow afternoon as well. So we're looking at 10 to 12,000 feet here from roughly Yakutat on down toward the Queen Charlotte's, cooling off to about 2,000 feet along the southern slopes of the Brooks Range. And then inland here, that cold upper trough here, keeping it chilly out over the Bering Sea. And the Aleutians and icing. No significant icing expected anywhere for the state for the day on Thursday. So looking at the jet stream here, high pressure in over the northern panhandle here at about 33,000 feet. Flow coming around that up to 75 to maybe 100 knots there over the eastern interior north of the Yukon River. And then lighter north-northwesterlies back out over the western Bering. And at 9,000 feet, pretty light for the panhandle, stronger winds down to the south, southeast 50 knots coming into Kodiak Island. High pressure making for light variable winds here along the west coast into the interior, even lighter and more variable that extends into the Yukon. West-northwest, maybe 20 to 25 knots for the central eastern Arctic coast. Northeast winds at about 40 knots coming across mostly Adak Island there, kind of a narrow band of stronger winds due to this high out here to the west and a trough right in through here. And for the 3,000-foot winds, light variable winds over the Bering Sea and the Aleutians. Northeast, maybe up to 40 knots there. Southern Shelikof Strait into the Aleutian Range a little bit there. Otherwise, pretty light over the remainder of interior Alaska, as well as the southeast coast and out in the Gulf. Turbulence, light to isolated moderate turbulence here, maybe southern Cook Inlet, Kodiak Island, and the Alaska Peninsula, and in the afternoon for the southern Panhandle. And after the break, I'll be back with a look at the marine forecasts.
Places on the surface, you might have these steep cracks and giant fissures that you would have to be careful not to fall into. In other places, you might see towers of ice right next to places that were relatively smooth. You might see places that were dark. Ice there takes the form of rock. It's frozen solid until you dig down into that ocean. So you may see some things that look similar to Earth, but you may see some things that are very different.
That voice you just heard?
I am Morgan Kramer, NASA scientist.
I love it.
That's Morgan. She's probably one of NASA's best spokespeople for exploring our solar system's icy moons.
Europa is a fascinating place. It has this liquid water ocean that's about 3 times the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. That's a lot of water.
To understand what makes Earth so special, sometimes you need to back up and take in the big picture. Remember, the cryosphere is every place on Earth with frozen water. And water is one of the biggest indicators for life.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it.
And so far, Earth is the only planet we know of with life. Although Europa isn't the only icy moon in our solar system, NASA has identified it as one of those places with key astrobiological potential. Morgan is a collaborator on the Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, an instrument selected for NASA's next mission to Jupiter's icy moon Europa. But she's also more than just a scientist working in a laboratory. She's preparing future NASA missions for success on the surface of alien worlds. This year, Morgan and her colleagues were in the field studying how life colonizes in fresh lava.
Earth, it turns out, has a lot of excellent, what we call analog environments, places that are similar enough to some of these other worlds that we can conduct some tests and we can do some analyses here. Now, they're not perfect, of course. They're not going to be exactly like Europa, but we can still learn a lot by testing in these environments. Some of these places include Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, but there are other places too, Alaska, Greenland, even Iceland. Any place where you have a lot of ice, because guess what the surface of Europa is made of? A lot of ice.
Studying the cryosphere doesn't just have big implications for Earth. It also matters for the frozen worlds in our own cosmic backyard.
If we're able to find life or evidence of past life on a place like Europa, that tells us that not only can life happen in other places, but it's common enough that it happened at least twice in the same tiny solar system. That means that the universe is wide open in terms of how much life we might find, the types of life we might find. It would revolutionize how we see ourselves and the possibilities for contact in the universe. It would be amazing. Oh, it's so exciting.
As it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving. My interest in glaciers comes from the sheer size of these things and how much they're able to change on human timescales. And so the amount of mass and energy being transferred by glaciers around the globe is tremendous. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to study from space.
Mountain glaciers are some of the most charismatic parts of the cryosphere. Some might cling to the edges of cliffs at higher elevations, then lay bare and flat in a broad plain, looking cracked and weathered like elephant skin, before tumbling thousands of feet toward the sea and terminating in a dramatic calving front. They're like motion frozen in time, until they aren't. They tell a story about the distant past and yet are incredibly responsive to the present. You can understand why they'd be captivating to all of us, and especially cryospheric scientists. Meet Alex Gardner, a cryospheric scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who's going to help break down what a classic West Coast North American glacier might look like, where high amounts of snow dump onto the mountains.
And at higher elevations, there's melt in summer, but not enough melt to get rid of all of that snow. And so that snow accumulates, it compacts, it turns into ice, and it starts to flow under its own weight, and it flows down the valleys. And as it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out and down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving.
Alex uses satellite data to study large-scale changes in glacial ice. But 2,000 miles to the north, Chris Larson from the University of Alaska Fairbanks spends a lot of time studying glaciers from the air. He's been flying over Alaskan mountain glaciers for many years, most recently on a NASA-funded mission called Operation Icebridge Alaska. He's absolutely enamored with his local rivers of ice.
And what do you love about mountain glaciers?
Well, they're in mountains, so they're really pretty.
You couldn't ask for a better way to experience Alaska on a large scale than to go flying around for campaign after campaign and look at all of the mountains in Alaska. Truly infinite. You just feel like you'll never see the end of them and don't want to either.
But Chris doesn't spend weeks away from home and family for the views. Chris and his colleagues at NASA want to answer some pretty big questions by learning more about Alaskan glaciers and how they tick.
You know, why does NASA care about these? Well, they actually disproportionately contribute a large amount to sea level rise.
In the long run, as the Earth warms due to climate change, the big ice sheets and mighty outlet glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica stand to contribute the most to sea level rise, simply because the vast majority of the planet's ice is stored there. But currently, it's the world's smaller mountain glaciers in comparatively warmer places, like Alaska and Patagonia, that are contributing about 1/3 of all inputs to sea level rise, even though they account for only 1% of the world's ice.
Mostly due to them being dynamic. They have water at the bed, which allows them to slide fast, and they react quickly to climate change and have higher velocities than their polar counterparts.
Back at JPL, Alex uses satellite measurements of global ice and computer models to predict ultimately how much sea level rise we might see due to climate change. But in the case of mountain glaciers, we also care about the local impacts of disappearing ice.
When we think of changes in ice sheets, we typically think of just what is the consequence for sea level rise and the future evolution of the ice sheets. But glaciers in other regions, like high mountain Asia, Alaska, the European Alps, these are places where changes in runoff matters to stream flows. In places like high mountain Asia, you have a lot of glaciers that feed the streams that flow down to populated regions. And that runoff becomes significant for water resources, irrigation, and agriculture.
Both Alex and Chris are passionate about understanding how glaciers are changing and what it means for our planet's future. They'll continue to use tools like elevation maps from the ICESat-2 satellite and detailed airborne measurements to monitor changing ice.
By the end of the tunnel, you're about 100 feet underground, and you're surrounded by bones sticking out of the wall from the steppe bison and the mastodons. There's sticks that are 40,000 years old. There's grass that's still green, that's tens of thousands of years old.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Coastal water forecast for the south coast of the Panhandle here. North winds 10 to 15 knots. Seas 5 to 6 feet. Central coast northerlies at around 15 knots as well. And up on the north coast, north to northwest, 10 to 15 knots. Lynn Canal, north winds 10 knots, seas 2 feet. Stevens Passage, north winds 10 knots, seas 2 feet, and north winds of 15 for Clarence Strait with 3-foot seas. Outlook for Friday for the south coast here, south to southeasterlies 15 to 20 knots, and the central coast southeast at 20 knots, and the north coast east southeast 20 to 25. Lynn Canal southeast at 15, Stevens Passage southeast at 10, and Clarence Strait southeast winds at 10 knots. Prince William Sound for Thursday, northwesterlies at 15, northeastern North Gulf Coast, northwest at 15 to 20 knots, western North Gulf Coast here south of the Kenai Peninsula, north at 15, and then some small craft advisory winds for the Barren Islands and southern Cook Inlet, both out of the north at 25 knots, and northwest at 25 for the Kamishak Bay area, seas 6 feet there. Northern Cook Inlet, light north winds at 15 knots. And for Friday, Cook Inlet, northeast, 15 to 20. East 25 for Kamishak Bay, east at 30 for the Barren Islands. And for the North Gulf Coast, east winds, 25 to 30 knots, seas at about 5 to 6 feet. And Prince William Sound, winds becoming east, kicking up a little bit to about 20 knots, seas building to 4 feet. Kodiak Island on Thursday, north to northeast winds 25 knots. The Alaska Peninsula, north winds 15 to 20 knots. And Bristol Bay, north winds at 20 knots. And for Friday, Kodiak Island, southeast to northeast winds 20 to 25. Bristol Bay, east at 20 knots, and east to north winds for the Alaska Peninsula at 20 to 25 knots. Eastern Aleutians tomorrow, north winds 15 to 20 knots there, with seas running 5 to 6 feet. Akanatka, north to northeast at 15 to 20 knots. And for the Western Aleutians, variable winds 10 to 15 knots. For Friday, Western Aleutians here, north winds 15 knots, and north to northwest at 15 for the Central Aleutians. Fox Islands, small craft advisories for northwest winds at 25 to 30 knots, with seas running 7 to 8 feet. And for the southwest coast, east to northeast winds, pretty light at about 10 knots, seas running 1 to 3 feet through here. And for the Pribilofs, north at 15, St. Matthew Island, same thing, north winds 15 knots with 3-foot seas, about 4 feet here for St. Paul and St. George. St. Lawrence Island, northeast at 15, Norton Sound, north winds 15 knots. And moving ahead to Friday, we've got small craft advisories now everywhere here for the Bering Sea in these zones, even Norton Sound, north at 25 knots. St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta Coast, north winds 30 knots, seas in the ice-free waters 2 to 3 feet. And for the Kuskokwim Delta Coast, northeast at 25. And for St. George, St. Paul, and St. Matthew Island, all three areas there looking at north winds at 25 knots, seas running 5 to 8 feet. And for the Chukchi Sea here, south to southeast winds 5 to 15 knots for Thursday. And the western Arctic coast, southwest at 15. Central coast, southwest 15 as well. Eastern Beaufort Sea coast, west winds 15 to 20 knots. And for Friday, generally variable to southeast winds at 10 knots for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast. Central coast, though, southwest at 20. Western Arctic coast, same thing, southwest winds at 20 knots. And the Chukchi Sea out here looking at east to south winds at 10 to 20 knots. For tonight, again, high pressure, light winds, variably cloudy skies, dry conditions here, all interior Alaska. Low pressure really weakens into a weak trough there. Maybe some lingering snow showers for the Fox Islands, western Alaska Peninsula, maybe some flurries for the eastern Arctic coast, and that's about it. Dry for the Panhandle. Tomorrow, risk of a thunderstorm south there, southern over toward Misty Fjords more likely, but most of that will probably stay off in British Columbia. Mostly sunny, or partly to mostly sunny southern Alaska, mostly sunny over the northern interior. This trough brings a chance of moisture to Kodiak Island.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.